Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, which means it is time for a content dump. Now, this is the very first content dump for the Concept Bay platform. So what this basically is an overview of all the new content that is now available on the conceptbay.net platform as of right now. These are the videos that I've been recording over the past week that are now available for the Concept Bay members. Now, if you don't know what the conceptbay.net is, there's going to be a separate video which we'll post in the card, in the description, and in the comments, so you can take a look at that so I don't actually take up the time from this presentation. And because this is the very first video, I'm actually going to be covering not just the content that I've done this week, but actually all the content that is available on the platform right as of this moment. There is a total of 3 projects that currently exist on the platform which I need to cover in this video, so keep in mind it is going to appear longer than what I think a usual content dump video length will be, so you can locate the timestamps for each individual project or course in the comment section and description. So without further ado, let's get into it. First on the list, a game called Dream Team Theater being developed in Godot engine. This is a game that attempts to combine a couple of things borrowed from a bunch of different games that I like. RPG elements from the Borderlands series, general style and visual aesthetics from the first BioShock game, and the playstyle of Call of Duty Nazi Zombies. First couple of episodes is pretty much all about doing concept art research, getting some ideas from real-life references, and sketching in pretty much the design of the very first gun that spawned this idea in the first place. This all actually started as pretty much me just trying to make some sort of an interesting weapon. Next up, we've started setting up a first-person shooter character in Godot engine, the cameras, the camera helpers, as well as the first-person character code to allow the player move around the 3-dimensional space. We started sketching in the basic environment layout, the level layout, and trying to match the scale of the level to the general scale of the player. We performed a few tests and experiments with the Godot engine materials, mainly just to get a feel for what Godot offers in terms of visual tools. There were quite a few peculiar observations I've made in terms of both Godot's offerings and my hardware. We've continued laying down the basic level layout, prepared a test grid texture so we can actually judge the spacing and dimensions of our 3D objects. After which, we have started working on the block mesh, using basic simple shapes to outline the placements of various objects in a level in order to figure out the pacing and the level layout before we get into the heavy modeling. We've also established a few potential lighting placements, notably one of which was meant to serve a functional and a dramatic purpose. Throughout the episodes, I switch between different tasks in order to keep my mind fresh and active. If I stick on one single subject for way too long, I tend to come up with less than interesting ideas that I end up scrapping later on anyways, so it's easier for me to just switch between the tasks to keep my mind active and bring my A game to the table. We spend the next little bit expanding on a level layout, trying to come up with some interesting geometries that would be fun to traverse. Then, as a change of pace, we have decided to switch to try to model our weapon sketch into an actual 3D object. We have gotten it to a point where all the major parts of the weapon are in place, but we've left any sort of detailing work until the later time when that's appropriate. Shortly after, we go ahead and programmed in the iron sight mechanics for your weapon. It's kind of roughly blocked in, mainly because there's still quite a lot that I have to do in terms of the animations for the weapon, so I'll leave the smooth transition between the regular state and iron sight state for the later date. After which, we get into planting the seeds of basic enemy AI and establishing a navigation mesh in the level so that the enemies can comfortably traverse the 3-dimensional environment. We dive into the documentation to figure out the methods and properties we have available to us to program the enemy navigation and behavior, and ultimately achieving in getting a single enemy to use the navigation mesh to pathfind its way towards us in the level environment. We end up spending some time exploring and experimenting with the generation of the navigation mesh, mainly to make sure that the enemies don't get stuck on physical objects that have collision shapes. In this shot, you can actually see the zombie silhouettes showing up on the white background caused by the light that I've placed earlier. This is actually the same light that I've talked about that I wanted to serve a more dramatic purpose. Those shadows on the walls, that's what I wanted to see. I wanted to craft a scenario where if the player walks into that hallway and sees many shadows crossing across the walls, he will turn around and run the other way. In the following episode, we switch gears a little bit and decide to model, texture, and program a single asset, one that is pretty prominent throughout the entire game: an old-school television. The premise of the game is that you are a participant of a survival television show, and the host of the show is constantly communicating with you via these televisions scattered all over the environment. A big part of this feature was actually creating the shader material that adds a little bit of noise, offsets and glitches the texture of the TV screen a little bit to make a convincing effect. There's a lot more that I want to do for this, but I got it to a point where it was a good start. I try not to commit too much time into a single tiny aspect or detail this early on in the game. Another pretty major aspect of the game is this loot drop chute hatch, which sticks from the ceiling in the hospital level. Essentially, it's a mechanic that allows players to spend their in-game currency on a crate filled with randomly generated weapons with random stats. The animations for the hatch door have actually been handled right inside of Godot Engine Animation Player, which surprised me at just how versatile and flexible this tool is. I actually find myself relying on this tool more and more for animating various mechanical and some organic applications in the game, rather than relying on Blender and importing and exporting the animations into Godot. Later on, we decided to go back to the TV model and change the fundamental method that we used to texture this. Before, I was using a separate material for the plastic and the wood and the screen, whereas now I've decided to properly UV map the object and create a dedicated texture for it using Substance Painter. This did prove to be a little bit tricky at first because Substance Painter's export settings have to be set up in a certain way to properly export normal data into something that Godot Engine can actually understand. We had then spent some time doing some concept art research of film, theater, and backstage equipment, considering that this particular level predominantly takes place in what is essentially a backstage of a show. It would only be appropriate to draw some real-life references for what a backstage actually looks like, so that we could populate our level with the appropriate props and objects. All I did here is take a screenshot of the level environment and just paint over it and sketch in the various objects that are going to be located in various parts of the level. As a matter of fact, one of the components of this level is the merchant's booth, which you can see right at the end of that red carpet. This area I had a lot of fun working on, and that includes both the space and the character inside. Which is why my next step was precisely to work on that particular area. We reserved some space in the level mesh, created the merchant's shop window, and then created a frosted glass material which distorted anything that was behind it, and this particular material went through quite a few revisions. We went back and expanded a little bit more on the level layout, and then started working on the concept art of what was going to be the merchant character sitting inside the very booth we were just working on. I ended up settling on the following design idea, and shortly after proceeded to model the character in Blender. We've also set up a character rig. Process, due to the fact that this is a mechanical character, was actually a little bit easier than if it was an organic one. We've performed all the necessary UV unwrapping to make sure that texturing in Substance Painter is a pretty smooth sailing, then popped the character right into Substance Painter and went at it. I had a lot of fun texturing this particular character. Got the white streaks in the mustache, got the fake monocle that looks like somebody drew it in with a permanent marker. I just generally had a blast putting the colors onto this character. Even came up with a little quest for this character. Something along the lines of some ruffians getting into his booth and drawing dicks on his face, and him hiring you to execute his revenge. In the following episode, we switch up gears a little bit and decide to handle the weapon shooting mechanic. We program in the raycasting feature in order to detect where the projectile is supposed to end, and then positioning a test sphere at that particular location. We also program in a placeholder particle to make sure that when the projectile hits the surface, it emits some particles in the direction where the surface is facing. Shortly after that, we actually start programming a feature which I'm borrowing from Borderlands, where the damage markers pop off the enemies as soon as they receive a hit from the projectiles. This will be one of several mechanics that I'll be borrowing from Borderlands. The next little bit is going to be addressing a pretty major problem which I have come across in Godot engine. The problem is that when you're working with large levels, you end up with a large mesh, and Godot engine, just like many engines out there, suffer from what seems to be a hardware limitation that a single mesh can only be lit up by only 8 lights, unless you work with some sort of custom shader and code your own lighting system that works a different way. These are the limitations you have to work with. The key to that is splitting your level in multiple meshes, and the problem with that is that now you have to export each individual bit one at a time from Blender. Now, thankfully, Godot engine offers the Blender plugin, which exports scene files directly interpreted in Godot engine as if it's a native scene, which means that all the individual objects in Blender are also showing up as individual objects in this scene in Godot engine. In addition, if you follow a proper naming convention, you can actually get this plugin to generate collision shapes for you. And considering the fact that you have to split your level into many different chunks, it would take you quite a while clicking on every single chunk, going to a menu and clicking Generate Collision Shape for each individual mesh. So when it comes to levels with densely packed geometry, this saves you a colossal amount of time. The only problem is that at this point in time, that plugin is glitchy as shit. I have to delete import files when I put the file into Godot engine, and I have to sometimes even export the file multiple times, but the benefits outweigh the costs, so I endure. In the next little bit, we model, reassemble, and program a dispenser button. However, we do so in such a way that makes this button reusable to drive really any mechanism in the game. Anything that can be triggered using this particular button. And we achieve this by not tying the button to any specific node in the level, but instead tell it to just talk whatever we tell it to talk to. And once again, in the following episode, to keep things fresh, we go back to level layout and come up with some new zones for the player to traverse. This particular section of the level was originally meant to be like a sewer level, because every game needs a sewer level. And I even went as far as borrowing the idea from Left 4 Dead, where there's a sewer level with an overhanging catwalk that breaks in half partway through the sewage dungeon. Eventually, I decided to switch it up a bit, and instead of having yet another dungeon, we're actually going to try to make it more chasm-like. The main idea here is that most of the level up until this point has been predominantly horizontal in its general design, and adding a level of verticality now in this section will pretty much differentiate this zone from the previous one which the players have explored so far. We end up adding quite a lot of geometry in these episodes: hallways, staircases, rooms. All the while, I'm constantly challenged with the task of actually making it look and feel and play in an interesting manner, and really try not to make levels just for the sake of making levels. Eventually we start experimenting with atmosphere, and then from all this experimentation, a flash of inspiration made me think of an idea of having a submarine, which will end up being the home of another merchant character in the game, trapped in the sewage basin against his own will, which of course ended up spawning the idea for another quest where the players are tasked on collecting certain items throughout the level and freeing this character and his submarine from the sewage by opening giant vault doors. Speaking of vault doors, something that I'm going to be borrowing from Fallout is a door design for an entryway to this bunker that tied into the lore of the game. This is one of the challenge levels where the entire section is designed to be a valve. You enter it, but you can't exit it unless you push forward. And this section here will essentially have the players make their stance against the onslaught of enemies while the door, quote-unquote, is booting up. We ended up discussing a subject of replayability when it comes to this game. We talk about how to make this game in such a way where it offers new content every time you play. And in order to absorb all of the content the game has to offer, you have to commit multiple play sessions to achieve that. Having spent quite a substantial amount of time on level design, it was finally time for a switch and work on a little bit of concept art for some of the regularly reoccurring items throughout the level. Like, for example, this health-giving vending machine. I try to use a lot of real-life references, combining various styles and various sources of inspiration, like, for example, these old jukeboxes and radios, and the old Coca-Cola machine to make up the final design of our own vending machine. We end up doing the same with this little contraption, which is supposed to be your mechanism for purchasing doors, which unlocks new areas for the player to explore and new loop-de-loops to run around to make sure that they don't get mauled by the oncoming enemies. More experimentation with atmosphere, more prop creation and placeholder items, and a heck of a lot more level layout work, hopping between different parts of the level and adding brand new ideas. I really try to put in an effort at keeping burnout and mundanity away. I try to keep it fresh. Whenever I start feeling like I have to push myself to come up with something new, I switch to one of many different aspects of this game that I still have to work on, which keeps my mind busy. And between concept art, 3D modeling, research, animation, and coming up with new mechanics, there's plenty to keep my mind engaged. Now, finally, in the last few weeks, what I've been up to is working on the merchant's booth, mainly the mechanic of shelves that the players can interact with. These shelves are supposed to have rotating components, which allow you to just walk up to an item, click on whatever you want to buy, and that item will go into your inventory, and the shelf slot is going to rotate to obscure what's inside. Oh hey, and look, it is time to put the merchant into the game. Now, he doesn't have any animations as of yet. I'm simply experimenting with positioning and lighting and just observing at how I'm going to arrange this character. Following that, I've taken a couple of episodes to block in a basic model of the door purchasing machine, and then using Godot Engine's animation player, once again, I opt into animating the behavior of this machine right from within the engine. Now, before finishing up with the door purchasing machine, I decided to address this problem right here, the weapons clipping through the walls, which is a pretty common issue with FPS development. Now, the solution to this problem usually involves a viewport and a camera and basically drawing the weapon on a different surface, but the problem with that is the weapon loses all of its lighting influence from the environment, and I'm not really sure if that solution really is worth losing your weapon interacting with the lights and probes and reflections of the game level. Don't get me wrong, the current solution technically works. However, unless I can figure out to get the lighting back and have the lighting affect the mesh of the 3D object, honestly, I think I might just opt in for an animation of the gun being lowered down when you are too close to a wall or an object. In the next few episodes, we spend pretty much porting the 3D objects from Blender to Godot, setting up the nodes, and placing them in the right place in the level environment. And this is the point where I have to start thinking about setting this project up for a minimum viable product stage. We've been working on this for a little while now, and we're getting to the point where I have to start putting together placeholders for many of the game mechanics to at least get to a point where it is playable. It doesn't have to look good, it doesn't have to look polished, but it has to be playable. It's very important for, especially a project like this, instead of going balls deep into the details and nitty-gritty textures and doing all the pretty stuff, I should take time to actually make the game work first, because it's much more difficult to make changes to a polished project than it is to a rough block mesh. It is exactly for that reason why, pretty much for the past few episodes, I've been heavily programming mechanics, but not really using anything super modeled or super detailed. We've programmed a couple of doors, we've also programmed the door purchasing machine, and we've done it in much the same way as the button that we've taken a look at earlier, where it's programmed in such a way where we can have dozens upon dozens of these door purchasers, and we can just tell each one to operate a certain door. It's a lot like working with prefabs, where you create a single object that is more or less modular and fully reusable with many doors and other objects for that matter in your game. In the last couple of levels, I've also handled the creation of what I call ports. These are entry points in the level through which the enemies, the waves of enemies, are going to be entering the environment. So they don't just spawn out of nowhere, they have a canonical source from where they come. We also try to experiment with some more lighting, trying to highlight the key areas of interest, and slowly but steadily, we get to the point when we can start programming the enemy spawning mechanics and get to the point where we have something playable. But as of this video, this is where we stand with this project. So let's go ahead and move on to the content for the next one. This is a project called Child of Aether. It's essentially started as an experiment of me trying to see what can I make using 3D in GameMaker Studio. Now, it started as an experiment, but then the game kind of evolved, and I figured, yeah, you know what, I might actually try turning this into a real thing. The only problem is that with GameMaker Studio, it wasn't really equipped to handle 3D games, even of this sort of a caliber, not at least without a substantial amount of work to compensate for all the missing things that any competent 3D engine has at their disposal by default right out of the box. So I had a choice. Either I pick a different engine or I stay with GameMaker Studio and spend way more time developing things to make what you see in front of you happen instead of making the actual game. On the Concept Bay platform, you can actually see about 10 or 16 somewhat videos of me working on the project, but what you will notice is that I actually rely a lot on external help to move the project forward, and the more it moves forward, the more complex my demands are. Demands which I by myself could not really satisfy with GameMaker Studio. But this was just about the time when I discovered Godot, and I've been experimenting with it quite a lot, so I figured, well, okay, let's try to develop this project there. So in the first episode, as usual, we started by setting up our project. Since this game was being developed first in GameMaker Studio, I already had a pool of a few assets that I can start working on the prototype with. We did some experimentation with the terrain and scaling, which actually revealed quite a few things we have to consider when it comes to level design, if we want to be able to achieve a large level in an engine like Godot. We've sketched in a placeholder ground texture, imported it to Godot, and assessed what it looks like on a large terrain. Shortly after which, we've started implementing the player character, which is a third-person camera view. Spent a little time figuring out the mouse controls and how to get the camera to orbit around the player in a nice smooth fashion. After all, for this game, what I'm looking for is a pleasant, smooth-behaving camera for what is essentially a pretty atmospheric game. And in the second episode, that is indeed where we got. We've gotten the camera to behave itself nicely and not clip through the wall or floor using some raycasting trickery, which, yeah, turned out pretty nice. The next episode was all about movement. The main task was to make sure that when I press forward, the character actually moves in the forward direction of where the camera is facing, and not necessarily the forward direction of the player object. As soon as the movement has been figured out, the progress pretty much ramped up. I started populating all of the existing assets from the GameMaker project into Godot. Trees, bushes, grass, torches, all of the good stuff. My job right now was to retrace my steps and get the project back to the point where it was where I left it in GameMaker Studio. This meant matching the mechanics and the feel and the atmosphere that I have achieved in the first iteration of the game. Which, funny enough, what took me a couple of months to make in GameMaker, I've actually retraced in a matter of just over a week in Godot. Which technically means that this piece of content here, this torch, is the very first unique piece of content for the Godot build of this game. The next episode was pretty much all about fixing the resources to make them behave a little bit better in a 2D mixed 3D project. Now, it just so happens that in this game, for every item, there are multiple designs. The torches have multiple sprites, the grass have multiple designs, the trees have multiple shapes. So I went ahead and started writing in the code which would randomize these trees on the go. Now, this doesn't mean that the level is procedurally generated. All the trees have their own positions and they always will be there. All this really does is saves me the time of swapping out the sprites and designs of the trees. I just let them do that by themselves. In the next episode, we pretty much continue with the migration of the resources, the grass, the bushes, all of that stuff that has multiple sprites. I have to import and code to randomize itself on the go. We also took a look at creating a halo effect for the torches, and the most important thing is because we have 3 different heights of torches, we needed to make sure that the torch automatically reposition its halo based on how tall the torch is. We've also programmed a proximity code which allows the trees to fade out of the camera's way, so basically your face is not getting blasted with tree pixels. The big ticket item in the next episode is the inventory. Of course, this is a game that offers crafting and brewing, so you will have to work with ingredients and you have to store them somewhere. On top of that, some quests will have quest-specific items. And, I mean, come on, it's an RPG game. We gotta have an inventory. There were a few things which were required of this inventory. First of all, we should be able to move items from one slot to another. Second, we should be able to move items from the inventory to, let's say, a chest or a bookshelf of anything else that has its own inventory. Third of all, the item you pick from an inventory slot should be snapped to your hand. And of course, if you close an inventory, the item that is in your hand should go back to the original inventory slot that you took the item from. By the next episode, of course, we have achieved all of these things. We have a placeholder chest, which is going to be replaced by a 3D model. We can open up either our inventory or the chest inventory. We can take an item from our inventory and place it into the chest. And if you happen to close the inventory from which you picked an item and it's still in your hand, that item will go back to that inventory. I'm using here the same graphical elements I've used in the Game Maker version of the game, but to be honest, they didn't really age well, and I'm gonna have to redesign them once I get all the basics in place. Again, I try not to concern myself with the details too much until I have the basics of the game in place. Now, something that I couldn't really do in Game Maker Studio, or at least not easily, is animate the individual 3D objects of this house. I wanted to give it sort of like an ambient animation where the windows are rocking ever so lightly in a breeze of the wind. Now, in order to do this, either I would have to export each individual item as a separate object, or at least each individual item that's supposed to move, or I opt in for using the Godot's ESCN exporter plugin for Blender, which will export this entire scene, this entire Blender project, as a Godot compatible scene. And of course, that plugin being slightly glitchy has caused me quite a bit of grief, so I had to figure out a system of how to make it behave. In the end though, we did figure it out, and now we have a nice, smooth, calming ambient animation for the window panels to gently rock in the breeze. As a matter of fact, for one of those panels, I have decided to program the animation instead of using the animation player in order for that animation to not line up with the perfect loop of the rest of the windows. So at least one window will always break the mundaneness of the animation for those who, are gonna spend copious amounts of time observing the windows in this game instead of playing the rest of the content. And in the last episode, what I wanted to address is the light that is supposed to be emanating from within the house windows whenever the light inside has been turned on in that specific room. So that has involved in me having to edit some pretty old files to edit the original texture map of the house and even create a glow map, which we can then use in Godot Engine in conjunction with a little bit of code to make sure that the light glows in the dark when, let's say, a candle inside of that particular room has been lit up. Generally speaking, I was aiming for a warm, welcoming glow in the distance of a dark, cold night, which involved me in using the emission maps and even creating some volumetric lighting by the use of sprites and materials. Another effect that I really wanted to achieve is the player being able to see the light of the house before he can actually see the house itself. I want it to be kind of like a beacon to which the player can navigate at a much greater distance than what he can see beyond the fog. Now, this involved me making sure that the sprites that simulate that volumetric effect did not get affected by the lighting, shading, and fog of the game environment. In the last episode, what we've done is created a custom collision-shaped cage, which used a lot less vertices than the actual house itself. This meant that when Godot Engine doesn't actually create a super complex and expensive to calculate collision shape out of the actual house geometry. Instead, using the Godot's Blender exporter, we can actually model a cage around the house and tell the exporter turn this cage into a collision shape, but don't make the cage appear as an actual model in the level. This is where the Child of Aether project stands now. I have yet to implement NPCs and battle mechanics, crafting and brewing, but I'd say this is a pretty good point to start from. The final project report comes for a game called Accursed Kingdom, which we will take a look at right now. Accursed Kingdom is a dungeon crawler co-op game that takes its inspiration from the game mechanics of Dark Souls and the visual aesthetic of Minecraft, but puts it into this low-poly, first-person pixel art-esque, dark and grimy universe. As usual, in the first episode, we end up setting up the basic project, setting up the first-person movement mechanics, creating a seamless, tileable placeholder texture, and setting up a basic project here to take a look at what the texture and scaling of the player looks like. In the same episode, right away, we set up the co-op mechanics, by which we have a split screen in the same game with two players with individual movement inputs and camera controls. We play with lighting and fog for a little bit, mainly just looking for various fog properties and how they affect the environment. There were indeed quite a few notable observations. And with this particular project, I have decided to implement both keyboard and mouse and controller mechanics right away. We then took some time to create a placeholder enemy, and I think I'm actually going to keep this one in the game. We also created a placeholder sword. Now this one started out as a 3D model, but we're going to change that up at a later point. We've handled the animations right from within Godot engine, which seems to work out as a placeholder animation, but we'll have to come back to that and improve on the animations a bit. We've coded in the animation triggers from the controllers and the mouse, and the whole idea was that you have a certain amount of wind up for the sword, and you have to hold the button down for a much stronger attack. However, the end result doesn't really seem as satisfying as I hoped. I did end up putting a texture on this sword, however, as you saw earlier, I will end up switching this for a different method of displaying the sword. The next step was to code in the knockback for the enemies, which, despite the poor swinging animation, turned out pretty satisfying still. In the next couple of episodes, I have spent time creating the hit marker mechanic, which makes a number of damage pop up from the enemy when it is hit. However, now that I'm using the same mechanic in Dream Team Theater, to be honest, I feel like it belongs there a lot more than it does here. I may want to opt in for doing symbols instead of numbers, something like hearts or some sort of keywords. Nonetheless, there are still problems which I had to address, mainly the fact that the marker only faces one of the two player cameras, so somehow I need to figure out how to get the two cameras to both see the hit markers at the same time. And indeed, by the end of the episode, we get just that. When the damage is allocated to the enemy, both players receive their own personal marker, which they can view at all times. We've also handled the creation of the critical hit markers, which changes color for critical hits, and even though they work and you can still learn from how they've been implemented, I am actually considering a more symbolic method of displaying damage than numbers and words. To switch things up a bit, the next episode I've spent figuring out how I would go about handling the creation of levels. Now mind you, this was actually before I even knew about the Godot engine's ESCN exporter plugin for Blender, because with that plugin, that problem is pretty much solved. I've spent the majority of the episode figuring out the scaling, getting a feel for the dimensions, and just to see how I was gonna go about the level layout. And the next episode was actually the point when I've discovered the plugin, and I've spent pretty much the entire episode exploring how to properly navigate and how to properly export, and dealing with the glitchiness of the plugin and figuring out how to handle it and just make it work. Following that, we started working on the replacement for the three-dimensional sword. This time around, we were gonna use a two-dimensional sprite on a Sprite 3D node in order to allow us to use a two-dimensional image as a sword. We've also experimented with materials a little bit just to see what normal, specular, and roughness maps would look like on something like a shield and the sword. While the effect on the shield looked okay, the one on the sword looked pretty bad. As a change of pace, we've spent the next episode sketching in some conceptual artwork for some of the level environments. You can only go so far from just imagining things right as you go, so concept art is a great place to think of some unique levels. I explained the process of coming up with the ideas for the concept art. Whenever you're coming up with concept art for your games, the items that you put in must have a purpose. They shouldn't be there just for the sake of concept art. They should be there because they're supposed to have a functional purpose in your game. They should explain to you as a modeler or a programmer what is it the game contains. In this particular case, I am designing the very first starting area from which the two co-op players are going to be entering the world environment. There's supposed to be a lot of loot, a lot of exposition items, a lot of documents to read, and generally set the mood for the crafting mechanic and teach the players quite a few things about the game. A lot of times the ideas in the art are not perfect, and I end up iterating and changing quite a lot about the core design. Usually this comes after a good night of sleep. After an hour or two of drawing basically the same room, you're bound to lose the edge of critical thinking and just start coming up with ideas just for the sake of having ideas. And in the next episode, I have addressed the biggest core piece of artwork for this entire game, which is the level layout for the very first zone which the two players find themselves in. Essentially, this is a colossal canvas filled with the general layout of the entire first level. And so far, the first level is the only level. I sketch in the bridge, the general dimensions, use multiple layers to depict multiple levels or floors. And I use some of the perspective tools implemented into Krita to keep my artwork in line and in perspective to make sure that all the objects stay within the same proportions. I would then be able to rely on this piece of artwork during the 3D modeling stage much more closely. As you can see here, I'm using a secondary layer to depict what is inside of that particular level. Now, there's not a whole lot of detail that goes into this style of drawing, but at least it gives me the idea for the layout of the land. I'm going to be coming back to this core piece of art to reiterate on some of the ideas later. The concept art stage is the stage of ideas. This is where I've gotten some of my biggest features in the game, some of the biggest characters and some of the biggest encounters that I think would bring the core value of the game to the players. The last episode in the series so far pretty much been going back to this piece of art and iterating and improving upon the existing ideas. This is where the project is as of this video. There are quite a lot of problems that have to be solved. For example, if we have boss fights, how are we going to handle them? Are they just going to be giant sprites, just like all the minor enemies? Or are we going to opt in for some sort of a 2D, 3D solution? These are the questions which we'll be answering in the time to come, but until then, this is where the project is right now. This is the content that is currently available on the conceptbay.net platform. All of the content you have seen here is available in full length with all the codes and all the tutorials, narrated and explained as we develop these games. Thank you everybody for watching this very first presentation of the content available on the platform, and I will see you guys next week when the next batch of content drops on the platform.